Hi there. So in this video, we're going to do some practice on the idea of the money multiplier. So it's the same idea that we just kind of talked about, where if somebody deposits 1,000, and then what happens in the big picture, right? How do those ripples in the pond work? So it says assume the required reserve ratio is 10%. So it's actually just like the lecture that I just did. And banks lend out the other 90%. Banks don't hold any excess reserves. All the money lent out by one bank is redeposited. So in other words, you don't have to worry about what we just wrote down, which was why the expansion and the change in money supply isn't as big as predicted. They're usually going to have that little caveat at the beginning. It says under these assumptions, if a new deposit of $1,000 is made, the initial deposit of $1,000 increased total bank reserves by how much? Now, initially, right, you would say, well, $1,000 immediately, but like, let's assume that they instantaneously lent out how much they could. And so that means that it initially increases bank deposits by, or bank reserves by $100 because they loaned out the other 900. Eventually, this leads to a total of $10,000 expansion of bank deposits. And that's because, right, we know that 1 over the reserve ratio is equal to the money multiplier. So 1 over 0.1 is 10. That's the money multiplier. And we know that the new deposit of $1,000, my dog is very sad. I'm talking and I'm not talking to him. Homer, you're okay. You're a good boy. Yeah, sorry. This is the beauty of teaching in the pandemic. And so we know that the initial deposit, right, is 1,000 times 10 gives us the $10,000 expansion. So that's where the $10,000 comes from. How much of that was the original deposit? Well, that took $1,000. And how much of that was from the bank lending? Well, the difference is 9,000, right? And in fact, that's exactly what we just did in the previous video, where we kind of took a look at like, how much did this total change by, right? Well, the total bank deposits went up to 10,000. Of this 10,000, 1,000 came from the cash deposit and 9,000 came from the loans. So this is kind of rehashing what we just did. Were you paying attention? All right. Therefore, if the fractional reserve had been 15 instead of 10, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more or less. So kind of ponder for a second. If the bank had to hold more reserves, they don't loan out as much money, what's that going to do to the total amount of expansion of the money supply? Well, if they're not lending out as much money because they have to hold more, then the total amount of money is going to be smaller. So it's going to be less. If the fractional reserve had been 5 instead of 10, they would have lent out 95%, and so there would have been more deposit expansion. And if banks had not loaned out all their excess reserves, right, if they said, nah, let's hold on to a little bit of extra cash, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more or less. Well, again, less lending, less money expansion, so less. If all the loans had not been redeposited in the banking system, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more or less. So if people held on to some cash, that again, that interferes with the bank's ability to lend out money, and so we would say less. Now let's take a look at a kind of related problem. Assume that 1,000 is deposited in the bank and that each bank loans out all the reserves, blah, 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 blah. For each of the following required reserve ratios, calculate the amount. What's the maximum increase in the money supply? And then what's the money multiplier for these things? So this is kind of taking that lesson that we learned a couple of lessons ago and extending it a little bit here. So the money multiplier would be 1 over 0.01 in this case, right? 1 over 0.01, which is equal to 100. Here it's 20, right? 0.05, how many times does that go into 100? Here it's 10, 4, and 2. So again, I'm just taking these numbers and it's 1 over what are those things, right? That's 1 over the required reserve ratio. That's an important thing for you to keep track of in your head. Now we know $1,000 gets deposited in the bank, that's cash, times the 100, right? But this is asking change in the money supply. Very tricky. If you wrote $100,000 here, you're wrong. That's the total change in deposits, right? So change in deposits, why don't we actually say that? How much is change in deposits? Well, 100 times 1,000 is 100,000. But of that 100,000, how much was already in the money supply? Ah, see, you thought you were so slick. But if you wrote 99,000 right off the bat, you are slick. You're pretty good. Now, this one we know is 20,000, but then subtract the initial, and it's 19. This one's 10,000, so that leaves us with 9,000 in increase in the money supply. This one's 4,000 change in deposits, but $3,000 change in the money supply. I almost wrote 3,200, and I don't know why. And then this one is $2,000 increase in the deposits and $1,000 increase in the money supply. Again, if this concept is not making sense to you, you need to go back and review that previous video where I talk about how just because the deposits go up, right, some of those deposits are including money that's already in the money supply. All right, now let's take a look at the Bank of Clayton. This is actually the same balance sheet that we looked at a couple of videos ago. It's just more questions from that AP problem that we're actually working through. So it's the exact same assets and liabilities. And it says, suppose that an individual deposits $5,000 in cash in their demand deposits. What's the maximum possible change in the money supply as a result of the cash deposit? And then what are 2 reasons the supply might not change as much? And in fact, that's exactly what the question was on the AP that year. And so we can tackle this part first. We could just say, because banks don't loan out all the money, and technically loan is a noun and the verb is lend, but whatever. Loan out all they can. So you could say that, there's multiple ways you could say this. You could say, or you could say banks hold excess reserves, right? That's another way of saying exactly the same thing. But if you wrote both of those 2 statements together, that's not correct because you're not really identifying 2 different reasons. The second reason would be because households hold cash. And the other way you could say that, or households don't redeposit all their money. Again, if you just wrote households hold cash and households don't redeposit all their money, that's the same thing, so you only get one. So you got to make sure you kind of know both of those ideas. But let's actually solve this problem, shall we? What's the maximum possible change in money supply as a result of cash deposit? So to answer that, we have to know the money multiplier. So we're looking for M, which is 1 over the RR, and we don't know what the RR is. So we can figure it out if we're just looking at this balance sheet. We compare required reserves 2,000 and demand deposits 10,000, and we know the required reserve is 0.2, right? 2,000 over 10,000 is 0.2. So that means the money multiplier is 5. Now we have this deposit of 5,000. 5,000 times 5 is equal to 25,000. But that's not where we can stop, because remember, this 5,000 in cash was already in the money supply. So we have to subtract it out. Subtract the 5,000 out, leaving us with $20,000 as the money supply change. All right, so hopefully this helped you. I'll see you next time.